Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you all are. Welcome to this global event, Biodiversity, Building Our Future. This is the first in a series of webinars, Building Our Future, where we at Arup are focusing on key themes that are important to create a sustainable future. More than 1,500 people have signed up to this webinar. So wherever you are, a warm welcome from all of us. Arup, if you don't know already, is an independent firm of 15,000 planners, engineers, designers, technical specialists and consultants. Our focus is the built environment, but we recognize that that depends immensely on the natural environment. My name is Jo Da Silva and I'm the Global Sustainable Development Leader. Our mission at Arup is to shape a better world, and we believe that better means sustainable, as set out in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable development to us is simply about balancing the needs of an ever-growing population with the ability of our planet to provide for us, but also other living things who are part of the wider ecosystem on which we all depend. Work by Johan Rockström from the Stockholm Environmental Institute and others on planetary boundaries has defined the limits to growth. It's also identified that our planet is at a critical point. She's sick, and the built environment and the way we go about designing, constructing infrastructure globally is part of the reason that we've got there. Last year in May, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services published a really very sobering report, which was a global assessment on biodiversity and ecosystem services. It warned that the current rate of global nature decline is unprecedented in human history. And that report provides unequivocal evidence of the importance of recognizing there's a biodiversity crisis as much as there is a climate crisis. Biodiversity underpins the health of the planet. Resources availability, food security, species extinction, diversity of plants and animals, and much, much more. Climate change can be reversed, but 1 million out of 8 million species are threatened with extinction. If we lose them, we've lost them forever. 500,000 plants and animals and insects at risk of extinction. And we've already used up 75% of the land that's not occupied by ice. We're hosting this event to share with you some of the work our Arup ecology colleagues have been doing around the world. Their focus is to work on designing a built environment that has an increased biodiversity and improves ecological outcomes. The purpose of this series is simply to share and to create a conversation, throw the spotlight on something that is an increasingly important issue. It's time to act, and it's time to act now. As designers, as consultants, as engineers, we're acutely aware that we need to rethink how we design, construct, and go about the built environment. Green design, green buildings is no longer sufficient. We need to get to a sustainable future, and that means thinking about restorative design and ultimately regenerative design that can meet our needs and those of future generations. We've got a fantastic lineup of speakers for you. And I'm going to hand over now to Janelle, who is going to compare the event and will introduce the first speaker. Thanks, Janelle.
Thank you, Jo. Hello, everyone. My name is Janelle Simonich, and I'm a foresight strategist here at Arup, focusing on the future of the built environment, and specifically on utilizing planetary boundaries for regenerative design. Today, I'll be your MC, and will introduce you to each of the speakers. So over the next hour, we will hear from about 4 speakers on 4 different topics, and then we'll engage in a panel discussion with questions from you all, our audience. and the event will conclude with some final thoughts from Joe. We encourage you to ask questions, as these will guide the panel. There's a chat box in the bottom right of your screen where you can leave questions throughout the event. We will aim to address the questions that are trending and most popular. That said, we won't be able to address every question, so if you do have one specifically that you'd like answered, we ask that you please leave your email address and we'll follow up with you individually after the event. Now I'm going to introduce you to our first speaker, Matt Davis. He's an associate ecologist in Arup, Australia. He has over 13 years of experience in research, government, and private sector, working largely in urban environments and cities. He's always had an interest in urban ecology, working with planners and engineers to incorporate design solutions to protect and enhance biodiversity on infrastructure projects. Today, Matt will talk to you about protected communities and biodiversity on Christmas Island. And now, over to you, Matt.
Good morning all, and thank you Janelle and Joe for the introduction. So I'll just start from the top again. Today I'm going to take you to Christmas Island briefly. It's a location that's very special and unique from a biodiversity perspective. It's also a location that I feel immensely lucky to have worked on and visited. On Christmas Island, Arup delivered a project that was designed to protect the community from natural hazards, while also minimising impacts to that unique environment, and even giving those famous migrating red crabs a small bit of help. Although an Australian territory, Christmas Island is located 1,500 kilometres to the northwest of mainland Australia and over 2,600 kilometres from Perth. There is Indonesia, which is only 350 kilometres to the north. The island was formed over 60 million years ago as an underwater volcano in the Indian Ocean surged forth from 5,000 metres below sea level. I guess when I say surged forth, it did happen rather slowly, with a number of uplifts every 10 million years. But this is a pretty important factor because it really shaped the geology and the biology of that island. As each time it raised from the ocean, the coral reefs that were formed around the basalt core resulted in the steep, fragile cliffs that we see today. As the island slowly inched its way to the ocean, it became a really important marine bird roost site. They were the providers of the deep layers of guano that drive the main export on the island currently, which is phosphate for fertiliser. It was this phosphate reserves that really got the interest of colonisers, which then contributed to some of the, I guess, troubled history of the island and its current multiculturalism. There are periods of indentured labour. It was invaded during World War II, bounced around from country to country, and it's most recently been used as a refugee detention centre by the Australian government. So there's currently Chinese, Malay, Indian and Australian communities on the island, and they all have different ethnicities and settlements across the island, which contributes to the unique character. All of this is set amongst primary rainforest with highly unique flora and fauna. It's a relatively small island, only 19 kilometres in its greatest length, about 15 kilometres wide, the total land area of 135 square kilometres. But across this area, there's a vast array of unique plants and animals. Its location between Australia and Indonesia has resulted in the development of really unique natural environment. And the combination of what is a suitably large size and its distance between other main land masses has driven very high levels of endemism on the island. As species were blown there or found there, they settled in and then evolution did the rest. The rainforests are highly unique, with tree species evolved from shoreline forest, and as the island raised up, they moved to fill a tall climax rainforest role. It's really a twitcher's paradise. The levels of endemism in birds are quite amazing on a small island. There's 7 species that occur nowhere else on the Earth. It's a massively important site for roost birds, with over 3,000 breeding pairs of Abbott's booby occurring on the island. They're the main contributions to the phosphate trade that I mentioned earlier. And the crabs are really unique. The lack of other species allowed the crabs to evolve and fill in many niches that would generally be occupied by birds, mammals, and reptiles. While the annual red crab migration is really one of the most famous and amazing spectacles on this island, Another crab that occurs on the island is the robber crab. It's massive. It's the largest crustacean in the world, weighing up to 4 kilos. It uses its pincers to pry open coconuts with the force of 3,000 newtons. Our human grip's only about 300 newtons. There's some really interesting anecdotes attached to the robber crab. One of these is on Christmas Island. A SAS team was there doing some training, and one of their soldiers came up to the rangers, really panicked because rifles were missing, and the ranger just said, "Oh, don't worry, it'll be the crabs." And yeah, lo and behold, they found a rifle chewed up, sitting next to a crab. A really interesting story about these robber crabs, though, is that they've also been implicated in the disappearance of Amelia Earhart. A famous aviator made an emergency landing, not on Christmas Island, but on another island called Kiribati in the Pacific Ocean. Sadly, she perished in the accident. Her body, though, has never ever been found, and there's one theory the robber crabs found her. Back on Christmas Island, the red crabs are more significant. The migration is a spectacle. Once a year, when conditions are right, and the first rains with the wet season, the adults migrate in vast numbers from upland forest to the coast. The red crabs always spawn before dawn on a receding tide with the last quarter of the moon. Incredibly, they know exactly when to leave their burrows to make this lunar date. The crabs also have a significant role in maintaining the ecosystems. The ecological integrity of the forest is dependent on the red crabs. They're omnivorous and opportunistic. They harvest and maintain the forest floor to keep an open structure, which is a unique environment there. They're a true keystone species. The continued existence of these crabs on the island is absolutely necessary. These migrations also have a major influence on human life and the settlements on the island. As the numbers of crabs fluctuate vastly over the year, and even between years depending on rainfall, they still need to stay pretty wet. They hunker down in the dry. But in the wet, massive carpets of these crabs migrate across roads. Roads are shut. There's purpose-built barriers across the island for crabs to get across the roads. They get up in amongst people's houses. They climb screen doors. There really is a interaction there with humans that is a bit difficult. So the project that I was involved in was on a small sliver of this amazing place, on a very steep slope behind a Malay community known as the Kampong. This area is adjacent to the only accessible deep water port on the island as well. There's a residential area, shops and schools. The limestone layer that's been formed by the corals that drapes over the basalt core of the island is extremely fragile, and ARP's geologists have been monitoring this slope for over 10 years. There's some mitigation infrastructure in place currently, which was nearing its end of life, and there was an optioneering and design process we went through to look at solutions. The protection of biodiversity was key to the optioneering process and the detailed design process. The rockfall fence location, when we were assessing this, the location contains areas of primary rainforest and scrub, with coastal areas directly beyond the slope. So you've got areas of rainforest where the crabs live, down to the residential area and then into the ocean. We looked at options that still provided the required level of mitigation from landslide and rockfall, but also to minimise impacts to biodiversity. Our ecologists did vegetation mapping, surveyed bird roost trees, and we also looked at preferred crab migration routes in consultation with the Parks Australia rangers. The standard rockfall fence that was the preferred design looks a bit like this. They're mesh barriers which are designed to capture the energy of a possible landslide or rockfall. This option had the smallest footprint while still meeting the mitigation. But as you can see there, there's quite large holes. It's basically an invitation for a crab to climb over. The crabs are really excellent climbers, and they're able to get perched on seemingly smooth rock walls. The design solution that we devised had to not provide an impermeable barrier for crabs. It also had to allow the juvenile crabs, when they're coming back up from hatching, to get back up the slope. Working really closely with the geotechnical engineers and designers, we came up with a simple design that prevents adult crabs climbing the fence as they're moving downslope to the ocean. The inclusion of the 50mm mesh at the bottom allows the juvenile crabs to get back up to their journey upslope. The project I've worked on here, to me, is a really excellent example of how ecologists and engineers work together collaboratively with the local community to devise a really simple solution which in this unique and natural spectacle. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt. It's fascinating to hear about how crab migration can impact biodiversity and planning. Also, thank you to the audience for all your questions so far. Please keep them coming. We'd also like you to help us prioritize and address your favorite questions by clicking the like button when you see one that you want addressed. Our next presenter is Fraser Maxwell. He's the ecology lead in Arup's Northern UK region and the environmental team leader in the Edinburgh office. He has 20 years of experience in development-related ecology, environmental, and sustainability work around the world. He works with multidisciplinary teams of engineers, architects, landscape architects, and other specialists on large and complex schemes, and he enjoys trying to solve large-scale challenges. This talk is going to transport us from down under up into Scotland and to the Macallan distillery, to be precise. I'm intrigued to hear about how whiskey distillery will play a role in ecological game. So now over to you, Fraser.
Okay, thank you, Janelle. So our work was for the Macallan Distillery and Visitor Centre in the Scottish Highlands. We were working for the Edrington Group that own the Macallan brand, and their development was really twofold. It was for whisky production to be increased by 50%, and a visitor centre to house the distillery, but also to showcase the production of the whisky and the high quality and craftsmanship that Macallan bring to that. And the design was very much to reflect the estate on which it was built as well. This is the grounds of the distillery. The brown roofs that you see to the right and the sort of silver apparatus in the middle, that's the old distillery. And to the left of the picture, you can see 5 green domes, and that's the sort of new visitor centre and distillery. It overlooks the River Spey, and the design was to reflect the setting and the landscape of the wider estate. And from the start, the client was very focused on not just safeguarding biodiversity, but enhancing it and improving the biodiversity on their site. This was Arup's biodiversity involvement. The tasks are down the right-hand side. The key thing for us really to get the scheme consented was the habitats regulations appraisal. The River Spey is the river you can see here. It's an SAC designated for otter, sea lamprey, Atlantic salmon and freshwater pearl mussels. And freshwater pearl mussels are critically endangered. They're at risk of extinction in some rivers, and as climate change really starts to bite, then the number of days of low flows in Scotland's rivers is increasing, and it's putting the populations at risk. The distillery was going to abstract, increased levels of water from the Spey, and also discharge any sort of wastewater from the distillery back into the river. So the volumes of that water and the infrastructure that was needed to do that was subject to a lot of stakeholder engagement and consultation. It was the sensitive issue at the start of the project. Construction was going to start, there was construction activity in various parts of the site, and so we had to check for protected and notable species throughout. And this was really the first time that we, as a team, that we got to play with motion detection cameras. So we had a lot of fun with this, as you'll see in the sort of coming clips. The badger leaving it set there. One of the things that we did was the client and the sort of project team really wanted lots of nature-based solutions. So runoff was captured by wildlife ponds and suds basins, and one of those was going to be placed right next to an otter shelter. So we videoed the otter in its couch and its shelter, and we got some really good footage of that. That was in close proximity to the Spey, and we weren't looking for anything else. We were just interested in otters, but we also got Sutton, as you can see in this clip here. And in the same location, we also had red squirrel. So straight away, it was really making us think about the diversity of the terrestrial habitats and the species, as well as the sort of aquatic habitats. And the client was really engaged with this. They saw it as a hugely positive asset to them. All of this was happening within a few meters of their sort of new visitor centre. Just as an aside from the Macallan project for one moment, this and another project in the north of Scotland where we had wildcat made us think that camera trapping was quite a time-consuming process. So we've invested some Arab money in the automation of camera trap data sifting. We're at the end of phase one. Phase one is focused on just identifying wildcat in sort of individual images. And phase two, we're just about to start, where we're hoping to be able to advance this so that it can categorize what the species are doing and also start to identify multiple species in the footage that we capture. So this is another view of the visitor centre and the distillery, the 5 green domes. Very sympathetic design, dug into the hillside, so it looks really good from all angles. And the roof, wildflower meadow roof, and it was replacing an arable field that was in that location beforehand. So it actually ended up with great biodiversity than we started with. Very much a collaborative project. Rogers, Stirk, Harbour and partners with the architect. Sky Garden did the roof system and Gillespie's did the landscape work. So stunning, and both inside and out. It really is inside of the visitor centre. More sort of nature-based solutions. The rainwater from the roof was harvested and collected in tanks and used for irrigation during dry periods. There was a whole system of swales across the site to sort of attenuate rainwater, and these all passed through suds and wildlife basins before discharging into the River Spey. So one of the largest wildflower roofs in Scotland, in Europe at the time, 14,000 square metres, and challenging to construct. There's some steep slopes and there's some pretty poor weather conditions there at certain times of year. Towards the end of our commission, we suggested to the client that they had such a fantastic site, they should really look to enhance it further. And the client and their staff and the visitors really appreciated what was going on site. It's still an active farm, it's still a visitor centre, but we really wanted to acknowledge the ecological benefits from restoring some of the natural systems and embedding biodiversity further into the site management activities. So we look to restore river meanders, pond enhancements, remove invasive species, wildflower meadows, native species-rich hedgerow planting, and so on. Needless to say, the building won lots of awards. It was the RIAS Best Building in Scotland in 2018. It won the RICS Design Through Innovation Award, but we did our bit environmentally as well, winning an award for environmental best practice from sort of design through construction into operation of the site. So in summary, I think the key things for me was that biodiversity was embedded from the start. It was a key feature of the design and everybody bought into that. And although biodiversity net gain isn't sort of mandatory in Scotland yet, that's what the client was trying to achieve. They were trying to bring about biological enhancements. And they really saw it as part of their brand and as part of the visitor centre experience. So just a fantastic experience to work on that particular project.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you for that presentation, Fraser. Whiskey and nature would go so well together. Our next speaker is going to shift gears a little bit and talk to us about strategy. Please let me introduce you to Donica Madden. He is the ecology lead in Arup's Belfast office and has over 15 years of experience in ecology and nature conservation throughout the UK and Ireland. He has a broad range of cross-sector experience and encourages collaborators and clients to consider ecology early in the design and development process to achieve maximum environmental gain. He's keen to see areas such as natural capital, ecosystem services, and biodiversity net gain be better integrated into decision-making and project realization. Now I hand it over to you, Donica.
Thanks, Janelle. Thanks for the intro. So my name is Donica Madden, and I am a senior ecologist at ARP in Northern Ireland. I'm going to talk to you today about a project that I'm passionate about, and this is work we are carrying out towards the contribution to long-term conservation, nature conservation in Northern Ireland. So this is through a project with the Northern Ireland Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, and it's to produce management plans for 16 special areas of conservation, or SACs. These have been mentioned by Fraser in his presentation. What are SACs? They're part of the Natura 2000 network of sites which are designated under the EU Habitats Directive to protect representative populations or areas of the rarest species and habitats in the EU. We are developing management plans so that these habitats and species, and are also known as the qualifying features of the sites, can either be maintained in existing good condition or restored to good condition. Now, Northern Ireland's landscape is dominated by agricultural land. It makes up about 75% of the total area, with most of this being grassland. And this farmed environment contains a range of special habitats which result from the wet and mild climate and traditional agricultural practices we have in this country. Some of the most notable habitats, which cover a significant proportion of the plans that we are producing, are blanket bog and lowland raised bog. And these are wetland habitats which have developed over peat soil over thousands of years. These habitats are significant because they can contribute to water storage and purification, provide a home for a unique assemblage of species, and are important in terms of carbon storage. The dominance of farmland within the landscape in general means that its biodiversity is particularly vulnerable to change in agricultural management. In recent decades, over the past 50, 60 years, there has been a large-scale shift from mixed farming to predominantly grazing systems. And this has led to a loss, degradation of some of the semi-naturals, which you can see on screen. Agricultural intensification has been the most significant factor driving a decline in species populations across the UK. And paradoxically, this has been driven by UK and European policies, primarily the EU's Common Agricultural Policy. And I'll not get into that too much just now. Although they are not obligatory under legislation, given current unfavourable condition and pressure on many of these sites, the decision has been made to develop conservation management plans. So our project involves three main strands in the development of the plans. These include meaningful stakeholder and landowner engagement. This involves identifying appropriate management, buy-in and local knowledge from those living and working in these areas. It involves habitat mapping, which is site surveyors on site utilizing a variety of traditional and more modern technologies, aided by pre-mapping via remotely sensed data and machine learning. And then identification of pressures and threats, which will then inform the actions or the management measures chosen to maintain or restore good condition. So how do we link these sites in rural Northern Ireland to the built environment in our cities? How does society in general benefit? Aside from the need or any moral obligation, which I'm sure a lot of people will feel on the call, to preserve the habitats and species of these sites, because of their own intrinsic value. The good condition of the natural capital of these rural sites is directly linked to the ecosystem services which the site can provide. Cities don't exist in isolation, but are dependent on the ecosystem services provided by designated sites at scales both locally and regionally. Research published in 2019 has identified that settlement areas are ecosystem services benefit hotspots in multifunctional landscapes. And on the screen, I've got an example of the Belfast Living with Water programme run by Northern Ireland Water, which emphasises the importance of upper catchment management for cities. Identifying the current condition and actions necessary to bring these sites to good condition will inform any future land management schemes, which is proposed under the current UK 25-year environment plan, and thereby hopefully result in the multifunctional benefits or the public good that these sites can provide being recognised and realised. This can then lead to appropriate financing to maintaining these sites in good condition for the public good that they provide. And this means recognising not only their value as land for agricultural production, but also the underpinning role they fulfil in terms of societal and economic health, including in relation to areas such as climate change and flooding. The production of workable, realistic management plans for these sites will help set out a roadmap for the conservation of areas supporting our rare habitats and species outside of urban centres, helping to meet national and international obligations. In particular, they will make the sites better core areas for biodiversity and thereby contribute to a bigger, better and more joined up approach to nature conservation. These plans will contribute to managing and restoring the essential natural capital that supports nature and society as a whole. Is this something that we've historically neglected? Yes, probably, but I believe instruments such as these plans can contribute to the current impetus that we now have to put this kind of action central to all our strategic planning from international to local level. And that's it from me.
Thank you, Donica, for your presentation and for teaching us about how natural habitats in Northern Ireland. Our final presentation for today is Rory Canavan. He's an ecologist with over 20 years of experience in biodiversity, natural resource, and land management. He leads the ecology and biodiversity team in Yorkshire and Northwest England. Rory's area of expertise is in landscapes, with a focus on generation flow and thresholds of ecosystem services from natural capital. He considers the integration of biodiversity and sustainability in design and specializes in large-scale infrastructure projects. Also, he's a member of the Scientific and Expert Committee for Infrastructure and Ecology Network Europe for IUCN. Rory is going to spend the next few minutes introducing you to a tool Airup's developed for people to better understand and consider biodiversity. Now, over to you, Rory.
Thank you, Janelle. So, hello everyone. In this presentation, I'm going to provide a brief background to the project, including the aims and the main drivers for the Horizon Scan. The primary driver is actually the biodiversity crisis, and Joe mentioned that earlier in terms of the IPBES report that came out last year. That's the context. Biodiversity, or nature, is essential to our health and existence. It is responsible for the food we eat, the clean water we drink, and the air we breathe. The ongoing loss of biodiversity and deteriorating ecosystem services contribute directly and indirectly to worsening health, higher food security, increasing vulnerability, and less freedom for choice and action. A key objective of the cards is to raise understanding and communicate the value of nature to us all. The purpose of Horizon Scanning is about challenging assumptions and fostering innovation. But crucially, it's also about exploring how we can develop thinking to solve some of the global issues around biodiversity and natural resources. The scan identified 5 key topic areas: habitat, biodiversity, agriculture and resources, pollution, and the climate emergency. So what I'd like to do is very quickly provide an overview of a selection of the cards that convey key themes within the Horizon scan. And in the context of the cards, I'd also like to leave you with 4 key messages. The first topic area is habitat. And one card explicitly looks at restrictions to movement for species. This card looks at the impact of roads, railways and fences as barriers to animal movement, causing isolation, fragmentation and crucially reduced gene pool mixing between populations. Consequently, animal communities become susceptible and less resilient to other pressures, such as hunting, diseases and other environmental stressors. The flip side of the card looks at traditional interventions such as green bridges or ecoducts. However, the card largely explores geotagging and virtual herding technologies, which can be utilized to contain and move animal herds without relying on fences. This has enormous potential for open landscapes. So there's an underpinning issue here in terms of habitat connectivity, which needs to be improved to develop ecological networks and support adaptation to climate change. But how do we do this effectively? And that's the first message. We need to plan for nature in the way we plan for infrastructure. Nature needs to be viewed as part of our infrastructure. Fundamentally, this is also about scale. We don't plan infrastructure at a small scale. It doesn't work, and it hasn't worked for nature. We see this everywhere. It's not an effective use of funding, and crucially, this is important. It misses out on the absolute necessity to embed nature within our society and economy. The second topic area is biodiversity. The value of nature is not accounted for in GDP, and over 70% of the world's poor depend on nature to secure their subsistence. With the continued downward trend in terms of biodiversity loss, it's the world's poor who are feeling the consequences the most. Put simply, loss of biodiversity makes the poor poorer. The reverse of the card considers biodiversity conservation as a mechanism to help communities to safeguard their livelihoods. However, there's also a far wider fundamental message here, a second message, and that is we need to incorporate natural capital into decision making. That needs to happen across the board. Our current global economic model does not account for natural capital and does not consider ecosystem services provided by biodiversity. This is about understanding that we do operate in a closed system, that is planet Earth, and we are constrained by ecological limits or planetary boundaries. The next topic area is agriculture and natural resources. One card specifically deals with soil degradation. Now this is a massive issue of increasing significance. And all I would just say here is that soil biodiversity underpins the processes and ecosystem services that are essential for agriculture. There are several pressures, but particularly the unsustainable use of land has been a key driver of soil degradation. The flip side of the card looks at sustainable land management and interventions around regenerative agriculture. And as mentioned, just to reiterate, soil biodiversity is the basis for sustainable harvests in the future. However, soils, like so many of the other interconnected biodiversity issues, such as health, water, in the context of climate, are incredibly complex and often seem overwhelming challenges. So the third message is that organizations, governments, communities, and indeed people, they need to understand that they can make a difference, but they need to know what to do and how to do it. So this is about the importance of message simplicity. We need to simplify the messaging around biodiversity, making it clearer and indeed trusted. The fourth and final topic area I'm covering is the climate emergency. And this is actually one of my favorite cards, and it's a suitable card to finish on. This last topic has a surprising flip side that has only recently been discovered and relates to the connected issues of both rising temperatures and carbon sequestration within our oceans. In short, the drastic increases in temperature undermine the ocean's potential to sequester carbon dioxide in the future. The reverse side of the card looks at the ultimate nature-based solution, and this is about how the great whales move nutrients from the deep sea to the ocean surface when they dive. They redistribute large amounts of iron, nitrogen and other nutrients to algae that exist on the ocean surface. These algae, catalyzed by this process, the whale pump, sequester 40% of all atmospheric carbon dioxide and produce half the oxygen in our atmosphere. So about every second breath you take has been provided to you by algae that were fertilized by whales. So if ever there was the perfect example of the interconnectedness between biodiversity and our planetary systems, it's the whale pump. So that's our fourth and final message. Biodiversity loss and climate change are not separate issues. It's a single issue that needs to be tackled simultaneously. This includes understanding trade-offs and synergies with nature-based solutions. So the final message is, if we can manage our natural world better, look after our wildlife, it will help us to reduce climate change. It's far more cost effective to maintain an ecosystem than it is to degrade and then restore it, if we can restore it. Conservation always tops restoration. And on that note, I'd like to thank you for listening. The cards are available to download at the link below, and indeed I'd be happy to take any further queries or questions. There'll be further information at the end of the webinar. Thank you, Janelle.
Thank you, Rory. It's great to see how we can make biodiversity and natural capital ideas more accessible to everyone. And with that, we're going to switch gears and head over to the panel discussion, where we'll address some of your burning questions from today. My last introduction for you today is to Natasha Connolly, who's an Associate Director of Sustainability and Environmental Consulting in the UK. She has worked all over the world and brings a global perspective to us today, while being passionate about improving sustainability on projects. Now, over to you, Natasha.
Well, thanks everyone, and thank you so much to our presenters for some fascinating presentations, and also to our audience for some equally amazing questions that are coming through quick and fast. I'll address the ones that I think there's some current themes, but please keep them coming and we'll see how we go. So the first one, really open to the panel, but perhaps starting with you, Fraser, would be, there's quite a lot of questions about post-construction and how do we monitor the effectiveness of the designs that we've done post-construction, so 2, 5, 10 years after the design is finished.
Yeah, so with Macallan, we're just at the point of sort of implementing the habitat enhancements, so we can't sort of monitor them yet. But what tends to happen on larger infrastructure schemes is that there's a monitoring program of key mitigation that's been put in, whether it's badger underpasses, bat boxes, that sort of thing. And actually, under the EIA regulations 2017, that sort of monitoring of mitigation that's been specified in an EIA has sort of become mandatory now. So I think as ecologists, we need to get a lot more evidence base about mitigation that we've put in. But I think that's going to happen with what's happening through the EIA regs, and more of that happening from now on.
Great, thanks, Fraser. And perhaps, Matt, this one might be most directly to you. How do you engage the communities and educate them on the interrelation between cities and the associated ecosystems?
Well, on the Christmas Island project, we had a stakeholder engagement team that we went out there and we met with members of the community, parks, rangers, people that manage the infrastructure adjacent to the slope. So from that perspective, I think it's really important to lean on the recommendations of other specialists that can plan how best to engage with the community. and then you can draw on their expertise as well, like some of the crab migration routes and the issues of crabs getting in amongst people's houses and buildings. We just wouldn't have known about that unless we had those conversations.
That's great, thanks, Matt. I guess open to all of you, but perhaps Donica, you might be able to answer this one initially. How do you make this type of nature-based solution applicable on more city or urban type environments, and therefore really create ecosystem-rich systems within the cities?
I think there is a general trend and a push, and it's been given extra impetus in the past couple of months through our sort of the new way of things going to work around our city planning and the greening of our cities. So I think it's nature-based solutions in our cities are being considered through sort of a COVID recovery, and how we go about our cities are designed. There's you can see in Northern Ireland, and it's happening throughout the world, that there are the consideration of nature within cities. It has come to the fore. So I think within our city planning, at a strategic level, it's at the first stage, and that's where the decisions need to be made. The development, the use of techniques such as sustainable urban design and sensitive managements for pollinators are examples of techniques that can be used within the city. So I think we're at an exciting time where hopefully these types of nature-based solutions are being sort of considered much more for our cities. Yeah.
Natasha Fraser here. Just coming there, for people listening in, they should check out Arup Cities Alive, Reimagining Green Infrastructure, and the series of work that was done there. And that gives a really good sense of overview of what we should be doing in cities and the sort of work that Arup's involved in. And then there's a fantastic scheme in London called Wild West End, where we were trying to sort of connect areas of green space within central London with street trees, green walls, green roofs, sort of pollinate. So that's a really good example that people should and could check out.
Thanks, Fraser. I was thinking of exactly the same project, so that's great. I had a really interesting question. Perhaps Rory, you might be able to initially answer this one. Is that the value of biodiversity is not currently included in the GDP, and it's not generally included in business case or decision-making processes. How do we make that happen? Do we need legislative changes to drive it into the business case?
It's a great question, and indeed very complex, in the sense that within the corporate sector, there's forerunners. So there's companies that are driving this forward, and the organisations such as Business for Nature, Act for Nature, are corralling these organisations, best practice and so on. And as I said, there's a willingness to do it. We see more recently with BP in terms of their net gain approach, etc. So there's companies stepping up to the plate. However, there's always forerunners, and I think it's there's probably a legislative requirement for the SMEs. It's a little bit more reluctant to pick up and take on the mantle. I mean, the narrative is here. There's the knowledge and the tools are here. There's always this aspect as regards as well. We don't have confirmed targets for biodiversity, but that's being developed as we speak. Science-based targets for the corporate sector. Yes, we don't have an apex target as for climate, but they are coming, and there's an acknowledgement actually. We can't wait for these as well. We do need to progress and develop the targets concurrently. As regards sort of wider concept in terms of society and so on, well, that's more difficult, and it's, I think, without taking up airtime, but it's really a lot to do with education. It's about internalizing our understanding of nature. There's a lot more of a deeper sort of conversation there around that. But that's sort of my tuppence worth, as it were.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rory. I guess there's been quite a lot of discussion about biodiversity net gain in this panel discussion. So a big question is biodiversity net gain in the property development schemes really going to make a dramatic difference to our biodiversity values and condition? If anyone wants to jump in, or I'll pick on someone.
It's Natasha.
Yeah.
I think yes, it's coherence. It's what has to underpin net gain is coherence in terms of where these interventions, where the additional habitat is allocated. So for a long time, there's been an aspect of holding a line in terms of environmental degradation, particularly within the sphere of ecology and development control. So for the first time, it potentially is a great tool, but there needs to be coherence, and we certainly don't want it to go the way of net loss in terms of a failure to adapt and sort of almost, I wouldn't say abuse of the system, but the manipulation of units and credits and so on. But coherence, and in the UK that supposedly is happening via the nature recovery networks, which will be underpinned by net gain.
Fantastic.
Natasha, I guess on that as well, you know, it's mandatory on every sort of project in England and Wales now, and I know Joe De Silva's got this mantra of, well, that means there should be a biodiversity specialist involved in every project, and I think that's what we've got to aspire to do, to really get to the heart of some of these projects and get our hands dirty and be in there from the start where we can make the biggest successes.
Thanks, Fraser. And we've just got time for one last question, which I'm going to ask each four of you to answer, which is really, what is the one thing that non-ecologists or non-biodiversity experts, whether they're an owner, a developer, contractor, client or engineer, what can they do differently or approach differently to improve the biodiversity outcome of a project? So I'll start with you, Matt.
I really think that there's, like Fraser just said, then having a biodiversity specialist involved in all projects would be fantastic, because the gains, there's a lot of focus on threatened species and I guess ecologists telling developers what they can't do. We're often seen as a constraint. Even this piece of gain in the middle of an urban environment or a city still contributes to some element of getting a good biodiversity outcome. So I guess have an open mind and think of the benefits that we're able to bring to it.
That's great. Donica?
I would be a parrot for Matt, but that's along the lines of exactly what I would say. It's embedding the consideration of ecology at the earliest stages of any development and getting specialists involved at the very earliest stages to identify, the opportunities, as opposed to just where ecology would in the past have been seen as, let's not break any legislative requirements around impacting on a protected habitat or species. There is the hopefully we can get to a place where we're finding opportunities to enhance and make those gains, and being involved at an early stage is what's needed to find those opportunities. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks, Donica. I'll just pass it to Fraser.
Yeah, I just really encourage, whether it's clients, contractors, or sort of the public, just to be really interested and engaged. And I think that's happening more and more. I think clients are seeing the value of it. The contractor that we worked with on Macallan was phenomenal. As an ecologist for a consultancy, you don't always trust contractors, but they were just really engaged and sort of really forward thinking. And then, we're working on a highways scheme in Aberdeenshire at the minute, where the public have been phenomenally engaged and passed on a huge amount of useful information that's really helped shape the scheme in some ways. So, I think that this is just happening naturally, but I think there's a real engagement with biodiversity at the minute, and I really hope that continues.
Fantastic. Thanks, Fraser. And last but not least, Rory.
Thanks, Natasha. What I suppose I'd encourage developers is that, you know, more often than not, it's a short-term view in terms of the development and the next one. And there's this aspect of custodians as regards the interventions, their enhancement for biodiversity, and moving away from like a structurally embedded short-termism, if you like. You know, these are long-term problems and we need sort of long-term solutions. So thinking just beyond the immediacy.
That's great. Thank you all. And I'm so sorry we ran out of time because there's been some amazing questions come through. But if you have put your email address, we'll be able to address them separately and respond to your questions. And if you've got any further questions, there is an email address on the page, biodiversity@arup.com. So please feel free to reach out and we'll be able to answer your specific questions. For now, thank you, and I'll pass it back over to Jo.
Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, Janelle. And thanks to all the speakers and to everyone who submitted questions. There's been a very lively set going on the chat channel. The key messages for me that come out of this are that we really share this planet with other species. We depend on them and they depend on us. We've got to work out a way we can coexist. And it's not just about safeguarding or maintaining what exists, but it's about enhancing it. I think there are sort of three ways to do this that have come out of these talks for me. The first is Don talking about conservation and restoration. We really do need to look after and enhance what we have. And protected sites play a vital role in enhancing natural capital for society as a whole. And as Rory pointed out, they're incredibly important as carbon sinks in terms of tackling climate change. But you heard the excitement from my colleagues about the opportunity to embed biodiversity within building projects like the Macallan distillery. But also, we're retrofitting the existing environment. And Fraser mentioned the Wild West End project in the questions. So my message to all of you is get ecologists involved early on. And we can design a future world that works for humans and for other living things. We can have whiskey and the giant crabs can migrate. And finally, Rory referred to the biodiversity trend cards, which can be found on arup.com. Fraser also referred to reimagining green infrastructure. This is one in a series of publications under Cities Alive. Also, they can be downloaded from arup.com. Please keep the conversation going. You can contact any of the speakers on biodiversity@arup.com, the email address biodiversity@arup.com, and please look out for our next Building the Future webinar. Thank you for joining us.